Thank you, everyone, for sticking around late in the afternoon today. My name is Ellen Mitchell-Kozak, and I am the Director of Sustainability for HKS in Dallas. I'm co-presenting with Samantha Schwarze, who is an architect and urban designer for Overland Partners in San Antonio. So today we're talking about what impact design can teach corporations about creativity. A lot of times when we're talking about public interest design or impact design projects, the stories that come out of those projects are all about the communities that they serve, and those are always great stories. But today we're going to shift the focus a little bit and talk about the value that these types of projects bring back to the corporations that participate in them. And then Sam's going to dig down even further and talk about the value that public interest design projects can bring to individuals who make up the corporations. This graphic here comes from Carol Sanford's book, The Responsible Business. And the bullseye symbol is meant to represent what she calls 3 lines of work. And basically what she says is that there are synergistic relationships between all 3 of these entities. And in order to affect change in one division, you have to start to look at all 3. So in other words, individuals have the ability to affect change within themselves and within the corporations that they work for, so it scales out one notch. And then in turn, the corporations have the ability to affect change within their community. But it works conversely as well. The impacts that happen, the positive impacts that happen within the community have the potential to affect corporations that live and work in their communities, which then in turn have the capacity to affect the individual. So I want to talk about what public interest design is, but I want to do it within the framework of the triple bottom line. A lot of times when we talk about how to define success, traditionally that definition has everything to do with profit, how profitable any given firm is. And when I say corporation, I'm coming from my own context, which is an architecture firm. Within the last decade or so, with the insurgence of things like the LEED rating system, the definition of success has shifted and expanded a little bit to also include metrics that have to do with the planet. So the more you're able to reduce your environmental footprint, the better. But the people component of the triple bottom line is often overlooked. It comes in a distant third a lot. And that's where public interest design comes in. So by definition, public interest design is designing with the goal that every person should be able to live in a socially, economically, and environmentally healthy community. So when we start to talk about sustainability, we need to broaden our definition. So instead of just talking about what our EUI is, our energy use intensity, or talking about how much water a building's consuming, we really need to talk about sustainability in terms of how to make people's ways of life sustainable, how to protect their culture, how to protect their basic human rights, and how to enable them to support themselves and their families. So this statistic, 90% of the world's population does not have access to design services. This is a statistic that has spawned a movement in and of itself called Design for the Other 90%. And this is really a frightening statistic if you think about it. This is saying that we as a design industry, as the AEC industry, we relegate our services to the top 10% of the population that can afford them, and we essentially turn our back on the vast majority of people. And if we start to use public interest design as a way to step back and try and solve some of the more systematic problems that maybe aren't coming from the top 10%, the upper echelon, but affect other people, that's when we have the power to affect change within the realm of public interest design. So that's sort of the what. What is public interest design? And I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about why. Why would a corporation, a for-profit company, incorporate projects into their portfolio where they're not getting paid, they're getting a reduced fee, maybe they're getting no fee at all? The reality is no matter how altruistic and well-intending a corporation is, that they're not able to sustain themselves long-term without seeing some sort of value that these projects bring back to them. The most obvious one, at least from the perspective of HKS, is the marketing potential. These projects, they have kind of a unique opportunity to tell a very compelling story about the power of design. So not only can we point to the building and the architecture and say, you know, look at what we've done, but we can also dig deeper and we can start to get at the stories. The people whose lives were affected by our work, we can start to tell those stories and celebrate our projects on a whole nother level. Personally for HKS, our moniker, our little motto that you see under under my email signature, for instance, is creating places that enhance the human experience. And so the ability for us to take on this type of work is really a way to speak directly to that and a way for us to really start to practice what we preach. Another benefit to firms is not only reinforcing client relationships, but creating new ones. A lot of the public interest design projects that we take on come to us through existing clients or even HKS staff members that, maybe they sit on the board of directors for a nonprofit, or maybe they are engaged in volunteer work with an organization in their community. Either way, it's an opportunity to sort of forge those relationships. And I have kind of a funny little anecdotal story. Mo Stein, who is the director of the HKS Phoenix office and probably wouldn't know how to tweet if his life depended on it, has a kind of a funny little saying that he says that he's very involved in public interest design projects in Phoenix, and he says that those are the most beneficial, quote unquote, social networking opportunities that he has. Next benefit is educating the public, and this speaks directly to that 90% statistic. A lot of times, let's see, sorry, I lost my place. So this speaks directly to the 90% statistic. A lot of times when we're starting to talk about architecture, people understand sort of conceptually what that means. They understand that architects build buildings. But there's a big disconnect in understanding how design and design thinking can start to solve bigger problems. And a good example of that is maybe a healthcare clinic. Let's say that we've got a nonprofit organization who wants to go and build a healthcare clinic in a developing country. It's a very, very well-intentioned goal. But if they don't have the benefit of design services, they might not think that they really need to pay attention to how they site the building. They really need to pay attention to where they put the windows. Because if they don't do that, they run the risk of not being able to capture prevailing breezes and naturally ventilating the space. So not only would they not be helping the people that they're trying to help, they could potentially be making them sicker by turning their clinic into a sort of an incubation for airborne illnesses. And then the last one I want to talk about is the opportunity for innovation. And because this is South by Southwest Eco, I sort of want to put this in the context of sustainability. A lot of times when we talk about sustainability in my job, it kind of comes after the big design decisions have been made. So it sort of starts to look like how do we get the LEED certification that we want, or how much extra do we have to pay up front from our capital budget in order to buy more efficient systems so that maybe we can realize some operational savings long term. Sustainability in that framework becomes more of a want, and it could potentially be a victim of value engineering and get removed from the project altogether if the project happens to come in over budget. But when we start to talk about public interest design projects, and especially ones that are in sort of third world applications, developing countries, we're talking about projects that we can't assume that they've got access to electricity, they don't have access to water, so that really turns sustainability into much more of a design driver. If we want to design the building with lights that turn on, if we want to design the building with toilets that flush, we have to be very innovative in how we solve those challenges, and in that instance, sustainability really takes a front seat and becomes a design driver for innovation. So I wanted to give an example of this. This is our inaugural Citizen HKS project, and I'll explain what Citizen HKS is in a minute. But this is the Kachumbala Maternity Ward, and Kachumbala is a very rural region in Uganda that has historically a very high infant mortality rate. And so we partnered with a nonprofit called Engineers for Overseas Development to try and address this. And really, when you're talking about any sustainability project, but especially ones in sort of third world settings, you really have to follow the right path. So you have to optimize your passive strategies before you can talk about your active strategies, before you can talk about your on-site renewable systems. And so what I mean by that is we had to do a significant amount of climate analysis from the get-go. We really needed to understand what the solar angles were, we needed to understand where the prevailing breezes were coming from, and we needed to make sure that we were orienting our building properly to capture those things, because this is not a building that's gonna have air conditioning. It's not gonna be heated, it's not gonna be cooled. Any air movement is going to have to be captured naturally. So we did that. We also, as you can see from this rendering, we moved the corridors to the exterior so that we could start to emphasize or allow some further air movement, we instilled these, they're terracotta rain screens. They're locally made and locally produced, and they allow for a little bit of separation of space. They maintain the natural breezes, and they allow some daylight in. And then the last thing that we did passively was that we put these giant roof overhangs on the building, and we did that to allow some clear story openings on the top, which maximizes the amount of good, natural, and usable daylight, but also provides shade and mitigates the amount of glare. So those are all passive strategies that we did from the get-go, that we as the architects had in total control over. In a traditional project, then we would hand over the project to the MEP engineers, and they would start to select efficient MEP systems, LED lighting, and the bells and whistles. That step is likely skipped in this project. And then we go straight to on-site renewables. And it's very tempting, even for projects here, for a client to want to just skip through the first two sections and say, I want solar panels on my building. Tell me how many I can put. I want the roof to be covered in solar panels. But the reality is that's probably the most inefficient way you can possibly design a building from a sustainability standpoint. You're much better off if you funnel all that upfront cost, which is significant, away from on-site renewable and into making your systems more efficient than they otherwise would be. So once you've got to the point where you've optimized your passive strategies and your active strategies, then is the time in a situation like this that we would start to look at solar panels so that we can operate lights. And so finally, that takes me to Citizen HKS. And Citizen HKS is an initiative that was launched about 1.5 years ago. And the intent of it is to be a place where public interest design projects can flourish within a big behemoth global architecture firm. Back in 2005, our then CEO, Ralph Hawkins, signed us on to a program called the 1% Solution. And basically what that means is that we as a company agreed to donate 1% of our billable hours to public interest design pro bono projects. It was not overly successful in the years that followed. I think there were some projects that came out of it, but nobody really knew what they were. They seemed to be sort of one-offs. And it was just sort of an invisible initiative. So Citizen HKS came along, and the way that I was able to bill it to the executives and sell it to the executives was to illustrate the list of tangibles that came back to them. So my pitch was, we need to actually spend closer to 1% of our hours. So that hits their financial bottom line. But in return, we need to be very strategic and thoughtful about the projects that we select. We need to make sure that the scope is broad enough that it starts in design and goes all the way through construction so that at the end of the project, we have something that we can point at as a testament to the power of design. And the Kachimbala project that I mentioned was our first project. It's still under construction. What is to be our first completed project is the Greenbuild Legacy Project. And so for those of you who are familiar with Greenbuild, it's an annual conference put on by the USGBC. And every year they donate, they do a grant, it's a $10,000 grant for a public interest design project in the city where Greenbuild's to be held. So this year it's in DC. And we partnered with the Capital Area Food Bank and Clark Construction and built an urban garden, and it's an open air pavilion that's sort of an education space. And so part of the deal with that is that it has to be completely designed and constructed and open and ready to go by Greenbuild, which is in November. So my plug is that if any of you are planning on going to Greenbuild, look for opportunities to go visit the Capital Area Food Bank urban, it's called the Urban Laboratory, Urban Garden. It's a great example of the power of public interest design. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam.
Is it on? Great. Hi. So Ellen mentioned I'll be digging into the how the individual plays a role in public interest design. And I just want to echo some of the sentiments of what, of what Ellen was saying, and just kind of offer this, that, we live in a time where there's unprecedented urbanization and development happening around the world in places like China and Africa and Eastern Europe, and there's incredible development pressure right here in our own state of Texas, and certainly in the city that I live in San Antonio, an incredible amount of development pressure, especially around the San Antonio missions. And so finding a way to create a more socially just, sustainable future is certainly one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century. And this idea, this notion that Ellen mentioned earlier, this piece about balancing social equity, the fact that people are central to sustainable development is really a powerful notion. The idea that balancing social equity is being sustainable is really a point that I wanted to underline. And in all of that development and all that change that's happening right now, there's so much work that needs to be done in order to even begin to chip away at balancing those social inequities. And humanity has a choice to take on that hard work. And Ellen and I, through the firms that we work with, HKS, and in my case, Overland Partners in San Antonio, we're just part of this larger movement of architecture firms that are taking on this really challenging work. Places like BC Workshop, Hundredfold Studio, EMI, Canon Design, Perkins & Will. I mean, it's really exciting to see this broader movement tackling these problems. It's interesting. Public interest design brings a certain set of problems and certain, clients that need to align with certain firms that are capable of taking on these challenges. At Overland, we take on the work that we take on because we believe that that there's something beyond what's apparent, that past a site or past a program or past what we think are the complex problems that need to be resolved, we believe that there's a deeper opportunity to tap into something truly inspirational that can serve as a catalyst for making these broader human transformations that will help to balance social equity. So, this just happens to be our approach that I'm speaking of, but really I believe that all of these firms share a common attitude that there are complex problems worth solving that would require thinking beyond the bottom line of profit alone. Not that firms that are taking on this hard work can't make a profit because they can. I'm just offering up that there's a more meaningful purpose for why firms are leaning into this challenging work. And this work is hard. It's really hard. It looks hard, and it's harder than it looks. It requires putting your ego aside. It requires being highly collaborative. It requires, creative thinking and problem solving from many different parties that have that you're bringing to the table to help you kind of tackle these problems. And really the whole point would be to probe as far as you can to come up with really smart and effective solutions, but that can be practically implemented as well. I think that this public interest design really attracts a certain type of person who's up for these challenges, people who are motivated by purpose and not by a paycheck, people who share common values, people who care about their communities and their place in them, but people who care about how place is made, but more importantly and more and more, they care about how they can be shaped or changed. I mean, this is something that's certainly a real-time thing that's happening in San Antonio. It's a very shapeable city, and our office is playing a large role in thinking about what its urban future really is. And more as architects and designers, we're needed to creatively think past the scale of a building, which we've conventionally sort of focused on, to think beyond that, to solving larger problems that are in our social and built environment. So something that we're constantly asking ourselves is, how can we, as architects, leverage what it is that we do well to begin to balance this, this social equity? In other words, while we're shaping the physical environment, what is it that we can do that will lead to a life-changing outcome of a better quality of life for all? As Winston Churchill said, you know, we shape our cities and then our cities shape us. So it's something that we're constantly challenging ourselves with. Okay, so Ellen was talking about, you know, how does public interest design impact the firms doing the work? But I just want to unpack a little bit some of the benefits to the designers that are actually doing the work. Not that the benefits to the people doing the work or to the firms is the reason for doing it, but certainly there are many benefits as a sort of professional side effect that kind of comes along with it. One of the most obvious ways that public interest design benefits the designers doing the work is that often we're having to have an understanding about a cultural context that we don't know much about. We're having to stretch our skill sets beyond how we're trained and really dig and take a deeper dive into understanding the more kind of complex critical issues. And at the same time, we're having to really be lean and nimble with our time and with our resources. And so, you know, taking on this type of work is certainly a great opportunity for a designer to, you know, seize the moment, stretch themselves beyond their professional comfort zone, and even connect with partners outside of the office, people like university initiatives, or even leveraging their connections with for-profit consultants to perhaps get them to donate their time. It's certainly a moment where the designer can kind of seize an opportunity for advancement. So whether it's trying to have an understanding of the philosophy of health and wellness of a Maori tribe in New Zealand in order to offer a housing pattern for a community that this design could be sensitive to those needs, or you know, maybe it's having a better understanding of the complexities of a certain community in China living along an ancient canal in Yangzhou, how they're living a lot of their private life in the public realm. A lot of what I'm getting at is public interest design often requires that the designer take on an advocate role. For example, stressing the importance to local mayors and city leaders and developers involved in this project that I'm showing here, and really emphasizing how critical it is to protect the existing community's daily life in order to strike a balance with new development that's being proposed to coexist with this everyday life of this community. One of the most, another way in which public interest design benefits employees is that you can imagine that in an environment where designers are encouraged to be proactive and fully engage with the work, pushing it forward, you really foster a group of inquisitive minds that are being shaped into future thought leaders and decision makers for the firm, but even beyond. And so past advocacy for certain places, this really becomes a form of design activism. This is a project that we're working on right now, in which we're sort of questioning and probing certain spaces in our own city and thinking through better uses for parts of an underserved place in our city. But I think by far the most powerful benefit to these designers tackling this type of work is that by stretching yourself in this way that I was describing, by taking ownership of and even mastering these creative skill sets that are being used to make a larger impact, that person is tapping into their own potential, unlocking what Daniel Pink refers to as motivation 3.0. Some of you probably know what this term means, but it's really this third drive that comes from within, a motivation from within, that it's not about a carrots and sticks format of work is done and then is given a reward, as if being paid more money would mean that you worked harder or that you got something more meaningful out of it. This is something different. This is about how these designers feel when they're working on these projects. That's what's propelling them forward. That while this motivation that's internally kind of driving them is catalyzed by the work that they're interested in working on, while that's a benefit to them, certainly, it's infectious, and the group that works together to also tap into their own potential and also use this own kind of third drive that no one else is directing. When you think back to that diagram earlier that Ellen mentioned about reverberating from the individual kind of back out to the community, and then, hopefully, we can hope the world, you really kind of get a sense of the power that one person's role in taking on this type of work can reverberate back out to the communities that we belong to, and hopefully, like I said, the world that we live in. Thank you. Do you want to come up?